Well, hello everyone. It's great to have you joining us. Today we are going to be talking about a topic that I love speaking about and hearing people's thoughts on, which is the topic of friendship. And I'm really blessed to be joined today by the one, the only Phil Knox. How's it going, Phil?
What a joy, John. Yeah, doing well, thank you. The sun is shining here in Birmingham. How is it in Sidcup?
The sun always shines in Sidcup.
Is that right?
I think it's about 25 degrees and, people out sunbathing. It's fabulous. You have to come.
The Costa del Kent.
Yeah, exactly. It is, I don't know. It's about 6 degrees. It's pretty cold, but doing all right. Probably a bit colder for you with less of the coverage on top, but
Thanks,
you're welcome. It's great to have you on. Now, for those who don't know you, could you just tell people what you do for work and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, so my day job is I work for an organisation called the Evangelical Alliance. We are about together making Jesus known. And my kind of title is I'm the Evangelism and Missiology Senior Specialist.
Wow.
I know, right?
Wow.
I'm beginning to understand what that means. Basically, missiology is a study of mission. So I study how people come to faith, how people become Christians. And my job is trying to help the UK church make the most of those pathways. Aside from that, I'm a part of the leadership team of a church in Birmingham, where I live with my family. I'm married to Danny. We've got two boys, Caleb, who's 11, whose love language is football, and Joss, who's 5, whose love language is fighting. Lived here most of my life. But my job takes me all over the place. And what I'm passionate about, really passionate about friendship, which we're going to come on to, but also passionate about football, sport. Aston Villa as my team. Who do you support, John?
I'm a Liverpool fan, and as you can hear from my accent, I'm definitely not a Scouser, but my dad was American, and I grew up in Weston-super-Mare in Somerset, so
Nice.
There was no teams nearby, so my best mate supported Liverpool, and I started supporting them too, so I'm still grieving that Jurgen Klopp is leaving at the end of the season. We're losing him, and Catherine, my wife, is still who you know is she still trying to comprehend why I was so sad about the news. There we go.
It's a black armband at dinner.
Exactly.
What's wrong?
We had a minute's silence before we had Spag Bowl in memory. As you say, one thing you're passionate about is friendship, and you've even written a book on friendship, which I have here have enjoyed reading. And why write a book on friendship? Like, why friendship?
Yeah, I mean, I came from two reasons, one pure and one impure. I'll start with the pure. I, like many people, had a terrible pandemic. So, as you say, I'm an author. And my first book, which is called Storybearer, which is about how to share your faith with your friends, that came out in March 2020 , which, if you remember,
so unfortunate,
was the week all the bookshops closed. So, as you know, John, you pour yourself as an author into something, and then, there's this tragic event happens, which means all your plans are kind of laid to waste. So that was the beginning of my terrible pandemic. But then, far more tragically, my mum, who'd been battling cancer for about 6 months, we found out that cancer was terminal. And so I spent then the first few weeks of the pandemic kind of then sat at the end of my mum's driveway. I was so physically exhausted by the grief and the discouragement. And then she went to be with Jesus on the 8th of June 2020. And what was really striking for me at this time was it was a time of social distancing, and yet I needed friends. And so there was the juxtaposition of these kind of two worlds where I desperately needed people to be with me in my darkest hours. And they weren't allowed to be with me. So this funeral that I guess you picture kind of the funeral of your parents, and we had to kind of do most of it on Zoom and then have kind of only 15 people there. But at the same time, we were just so unbelievably loved. And, we didn't cook a meal for like 3 months. Our kitchen looked like Clinton's cards. Our living room looked like a florist. We were just so loved. And so that kind of birthed in me this kind of passion for friendship. I just began to think this is just the need of the hour in that context. Then the impure motive came because I think later that year or the next year, we as the Evangelical Alliance did some research into why Christians don't share their faith with their friends. Now, we know from other research that the most kind of important human influence in someone becoming a Christian isn't a church leader like you or an evangelist like me. It's a friend, a neighbor, colleague, or a family member. That's the most important human influence when people talk about their journeys to faith. And so we asked Christians, why don't you share your faith with your friends? And my first book was about helping Christians do that, but it turns out that was answering the wrong question, because the right question would be how we help people have friends, because the number one reasons why Christians don't share their faith with their friends is they don't have any. So at the latest count in 2022, a separate piece of research found that 46% of Christians don't know a non-Christian well enough to invite them to church.
Wow.
So I guess as a missiologist, I'm thinking, how do we help people come to know Jesus? Well, we need good friends. And let me state from the start, we might come into this later, we don't become friends with people to convert them. We're friends with people because we're made in the image of the relational God. So first of all, hear me well on that before we dive further into that. So that, alongside the need I had for friends during the pandemic, fueled this interest in friendship. And I just read everything I could find on the subject, researched the heck out of it, and decided that there was hardly any Christian writing on the subject. So I decided to contribute the book. And it's become a real passion of mine. And as I kind of go around churches, just see the real need for talking about it, which is why it's so brilliant we're doing this podcast on it today.
Wow, that stat is really interesting. And just stepping back, maybe broader, just beyond Christians specifically, obviously, I mean, you've got some in your book, and I think a lot of people will be aware of some of the stats and stories that reveal how lonely we are as a nation. And you and I both live in cities, and it's fascinating how even in cities, you've got all these people, and yet often higher levels of loneliness. It's kind of like we're strangers in a crowded room. And you'd think in 2024, we should be the most connected. We should have the best opportunities to form deep friendships, because we can call someone easier than ever before. We can see their face, and probably soon with VR, we'll feel like they're sat in the room, all these different things. And you think technology would help form friendships, and yet it appears that we're becoming more lonely. And maybe it's an obvious answer of we need more friends, but why do you think we are so lonely as a nation?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, just coming back to on the stats, you know, one in 3 men say they have no close friends. It's not much better for women. 40% of 16 to 24-year-olds say they always often feel lonely. There's a ministry in government whose responsibility is loneliness. The World Health Organization at the end of last year declared that there is a loneliness epidemic in our world. And so the reasons, I think there's loads of reasons. I think we could look at the way in which social media has changed the dynamic of friendships. So I think the digital revolution is still relatively new. And I think one of the revolutions that's taken place with the digital revolution that you alluded to when you talked about technology is there's been a relational revolution that's taken place. And one of the consequences of that is that we're just beginning to view the way we connect with other human beings differently. So one of my observations is we've got more connections than ever before, but a lot fewer kind of close confidants. That's a real problem. I think we're also moving around more. So there are some UK cities with a kind of turnover of 20% or more, and it just takes time to form friendships. Statistically, most of us will make friends at work or at school. So it's in those places where we kind of have to go, where we kind of form friendships. And if we're moving around, some of those take time. I think there's also the issue of just pure neglect. So we don't talk about it very much. We don't preach about it at church. We don't talk about it in friendships. We kind of assume that everyone can kind of make friends. And if they can't, they're kind of weird. But I think for all of us, we can all strengthen our relational muscles. And another kind of example within that, we talk about romantic love loads. So if you looked at your Spotify playlists, there's loads of songs on kind of romantic love. It's very few on friendship.
True.
Most people would know when Valentine's Day is, but very few would know when the International Day of Friendship is. 30th of July for this year. Get it
there we go.
And celebrate. So I think all of those factors are kind of combining to create a real issue. And then the number one reason I think within that is also busyness. I do believe time is oxygen to friendship, and we are of course have the same amount of time as human beings have always had, but we are spending that time differently. And all of those factors do mean we are creating a world, especially in the Western world, where we're swimming against the tide of good friendship.
Definitely. For me, one of my favorite things to read on friendship, other than, of course, The Best of Friends by Phil Knox.
It's a second plug.
Now.
Get 5
yeah, see if I can. Yeah. You're going to send me the commission, right? You said. Cool, that's good. C.S. Lewis, he writes in, The Four Loves about different types of relationship, including friendship. And this quote has always stood out to me, where he says, "To the ancients, friendship seemed the happiest and most fully human of all loves, the crown of life in the school of virtue. The modern world, in comparison, ignores it. We admit, of course, that besides a wife and family, a man needs a few friends. It is something quite marginal, not a main course in life's banquet, a diversion, something that fills up the chinks of one's time. How has this come about?" And obviously, Lewis wrote that many decades, in the last century. But and I think if he wrote now, it'd be even more true. Why is it there is, and he talks again in The Four Loves about this, but why is it that we, historically in certain moments in history in ancient times, perhaps friendship was upheld as this wonderful thing, but now it does seem a bit like almost a bit twee, a bit unnecessary, especially I would say when people get married, as Lewis says. It's kind of like, you don't really need friends now because you've got your wife who's your best friend, and it's a bit irrelevant now. Like, you had plan B with your mates, now you've got plan A with your wife. Why would a man need anything beyond that? Like, why do you think we've developed that such a low view of friendship?
Yeah, I think my initial reaction is, I think we're all products of our culture. And I think when we look at our culture, the heroes that we have and the relational heroes that we have aren't friends. So even when you look at Friends, which the TV show, which apparently is making a massive comeback. Apparently, Gen Z are properly all over. Ross, Rachel, Chandler, Phoebe, etc. Even that is you might argue is primarily about romantic relationships. The main storyline, arguably, is Ross and Rachel, not Chandler and Joey. So I think we're products of our culture in which we celebrate different things, and I think friendship has been hugely neglected within our culture. The storyline of most Friends might talk about romantic relationships far more than it does about the kind of heroes within friendship. But I think also one of my kind of huge kind of penny drop moments has been when realizing the finiteness of our time that we have, but also our relational capacity. So we only have so much to be able to give away. And I think where, you and I both married, John, trying not to each other, but trying to find trying to find that space. We're told constantly, prioritize your family, prioritize your spouse. And that's really, really important. But I think I would also argue that a healthy marriage and a healthy family have to also be blessed with and balanced with healthy friendships. And you'll have a healthier marriage and healthier family if you've got good friends to support you as a really good husband or wife and as a really good mum or dad.
Definitely. And I think, as you say, there's this view of friendships competing with marriage, whereas, as you say, I really do think that having solid friendships is a blessing, not a competition for your marriage. And no one person is ever meant to take your full relational weight, and that's a huge burden to place on someone. Even just practically, if you need to have a chat about some of your struggles within marriage, you're of course not going to go to your spouse and say, here's what I mean. Obviously you're going to have those chats, but if you want a sounding board, if you want someone to walk it through with you, give you another perspective, you need those friends. And I think so many marriages actually struggle, not because they're spending too much time because they're not spending enough time together. It's because actually they're not spending time in other places. And obviously you can build friendships as a couple, say with other people, other couples and singles, but there is something about building those friendships outside of your marriage. And as you say, I think for men, that's a real stereotypically a real struggle. And do you think it's a nurture? I know this is a big question, but for men, why do you think it is often we're more individualistic? Do you think that's a nurture thing, a nature thing? I mean, that's a huge question.
Yeah, it is a huge question, and it's really important. It's really important, and there's some great books that dig into it far better than mine. But I think one of my observations is that men are traditionally and very stereotypically less good at opening up and being vulnerable. And I think one of the things I explore in the book is what are the characteristics of great friendships, and what have you got to do almost?
Mm-hmm.
What are the kind of bits of you've got to dig into, and what are the muscles you've got to exercise to have great friendships? And I would say things like time and presence and vulnerability are really important. And I think it doesn't matter how much time you spend with somebody, if your conversations never go below the surface, then you're going to really struggle to build the levels of trust that lead to great friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And again, stereotypically, men are less good about talking about their weaknesses and their failures and their struggles than they are about football.
Yeah, it's true.
You know, and I've got friends. I've genuinely got friends who I've known for over 20 years, who I've really tried now and again to dig below the surface and just got nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
I've got other friends for whom there've been real breakthrough moments. And I think if you've got a good friend and you're listening to this, you'll probably identify moments where you or they opened up, and that suddenly led into a beautiful virtuous spiral of kind of mutual vulnerability, which has led to trust. You know, I love the quote. I wish it was my own, that said, if you want acquaintances, tell them your successes. But if you want friends, tell them your failures and your hopes and your dreams. And I think there's something so powerful about that leads to depth of friendship. And men are traditionally less good at that.
Mm-hmm. In terms of time, so those things, what do you say, time, presence, and vulnerability?
Yeah.
So in terms of time, as you say, a lot of people, be listening to this podcast and say, look, you don't have to convince me, Phil, that friendship's a good thing, but just where is the time? And I think we can all relate to how I don't think it ever gets easier. Maybe when you retire, perhaps, although a lot of the retired people I speak to talk about how busy they are. But like for me, when I think back to when I was at university, it was a common occurrence for me to spend time with the same people 4 or 5 times a week, and the speed at which you're developing those friendships, in the space of 3 years, I knew some people at university closer than I'd known, mates I'd known for 15, 20 years.
Right.
And how is there a way, or is it just an impossible task to try and find time for friendship in the midst of our busy world where we fill every second, and with all especially when you've got a family like you do? Is it possible to find time? How do we do that? Is it worth it? Any thoughts you could give on that?
Yeah, I'm going to begin by throwing some C.S. Lewis back at you.
Nice.
And so what he did, which is really helpful, which then I'll bring in some science in a minute. So C.S. Lewis talked about there being kind of different grades of friendship. Mm-hmm. So he talked about golden friendship, silver friendship, and he says, actually, it's really good to have different almost levels of depth of friendship. And so one of kind of the key things that I'd love us to think about is how intentional we are with a few people. And I think that's kind of what C.S. Lewis was trying to talk about that. And then one of the things I found as I've looked into the science of friendship is that there's a genius, in fact, you can go on video because I show you, there's a genius anthropologist called Robin Dunbar who wrote this book called Friends. Yep. And one of the leading experts on kind of our ability to connect, not a Christian anthropologist. Mm-hmm. And he worked out the kind of capacity we have with our relational energy to be able to give one another the right amount of time. So he found we can have about 150 friends. That's our absolute limit. If you've got 2,000 friends on Facebook, they are not all your friends. Mm-hmm. By the way, if you've also got about 3 friends, don't worry. 150 is the upper limit. So don't start panicking. But then what he did was he asked, how many good friends can you have and how many great friends can you have? And he found you can have about 12 good friends and 3 great friends. And as I'm reading this from this kind of non-Christian anthropologist, I'm like, that sounds really
Reminds
familiar.
Me of another story.
Right. It turns out when the Son of God came from highest heaven to lowest earth to change the world, he kind of had about, exactly 12 people who were really his good friends, and then 3 great friends. Yep. And I was fascinated by, I think it's 4 or 5 moments in the Gospels where Jesus says to 9 of the disciples, you stay there. And he says to Peter, James, and John, come with me. And so the first thing I'd say when we think about kind of how we prioritize our time, we can't extend our hours, but we can prioritize our time. And we can do so really well with a finite number of friends. And so I think what I've found as I've kind of talked to people over the last few years about friendship is that as a lot of people, especially men, have lots of mates. And mate is this beautiful term, isn't it, John? You know, mate. All right, mate.
Yeah.
You know,
Especially if you've forgotten someone's name, you just go for that. Hey, mate.
It covers a multitude of sins.
Amen.
And but loads of people have said, I've got loads of mates. I'm not sure I've only got any really deep friends. And so what I would encourage us to do is think about, with our mates, who are the people we're really going to prioritize? And it can actually be 2 or 3 people. You know, that's our capacity for great friendship. And if Jesus can do that, and, you know, if Jesus did that, then that's a really good precedent for us. And so I think finding a few people who we can really go to another level of friendship with, in terms of kind of that, in those terms, those places, time, presence, and vulnerability. And it does mean spending a disproportionate amount of time with them. And so that would be my first kind of piece of advice, really, if you're listening to this and want to really develop some friendships.
And that, in some ways, I think feels like it almost goes against some of our even Christian sensibilities of, it feels a bit exclusionary. I mean, you think of, we don't really often picture the 9 disciples who got left behind. We think about the 3 who went, but actually there is an element, like you say, of intentionality. And I suppose at its core, love is exclusionary. You know, if you're gonna, you know, when you commit to a spouse, you're saying, you know, I choose to love you at the kind of the cost of excluding others in this same level of intimacy we have. So we all do have views that it's okay to exclude, but I think what can happen is sometimes people do spread themselves quite thin, as you say, and there's not the disproportionate amount of time with a fewer number of people. But I think maybe for some as well, they might say, well, I don't feel like I have, maybe it's a chicken and egg thing, I don't have those people who to invest that time in, like right now. So, you know, even for me, moving to a new place, it's like, how do you pick those people who I haven't had the time with them, I haven't had the presence with them, I haven't had the vulnerability. I've got mates back from where I came from, but I can only see them every few months, and I want to keep that going. But have you got any thoughts on, with such a transient time of life, especially again in city life like you and I experience, how do you find those mates? Because I think a lot of people are just like, is it worth it? Because what if they move away? Like, is it really worth investing the time and the presence and the vulnerability?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is, it is really worth it. So the first, friendship is so good for us. We're created for it. It is really worth it. And you know what? We will get hurt. I think that's the other thing. If you've never been hurt in friendship, you're probably not doing it right. I just, you know, I think that's the first thing. And one of the things, since exploring this and talking about it and preaching on it, there's a lot of healing that needs to go on, but that doesn't mean it doesn't really matter and it's not really important. So I would say, wherever you are, in whatever stage of life, you need friends, and it's worth investing that time in. I think then the question then comes, like, how do you develop friendship? How do you make friends well? And you alluded to something really significant, and that is that it does take time. So you know, you can't, oven ready friendships don't exist, and sometimes we even need to decide when we move somewhere, or whether we move or not. One of the things we possibly overlook is the kind of the consequence to our friendships. So, you know,
just say a bit more about that. So you're saying sometimes people might think, primarily, I'm going to move here because it's a better job, I'm going to get better pay,
or better house, or better schools, or whatever.
But they've not thought, actually, I'm going to lose a lot in friendship. Just say a bit more of that, because I've never actually heard
so I mean, I guess
it's
a very personal question. I mean, if any of my friends are listening, I'm not thinking of moving. But the single biggest factor, I think, for me, genuinely, as a 40-year-old man, if I got offered a better job for more money, or a better schools for our kids — we live on a council estate in Birmingham, so definitely there are better schools for our kids and bigger houses and the rest of it. One of the single biggest factors why I wouldn't move, or it would be a really difficult decision to move, is we are really relationally rooted here. And that would be the single biggest factor, probably, knowing what I know about friendship, and knowing the kind of the time it takes to build new friendships and their importance, not just for me, but for other people. So I think that's just a consideration. It might not be the only consideration, but it's a really important one whenever we think about kind of big life choices. And I do know people who've moved to another city 10 years ago and are still struggling to make friends where they are, because it does take time, and especially in a busy world. But of course, that's not, you know, we don't live in a utopia, and there's sometimes we have to move, or sometimes things happen, or whatever. So when it comes to them making friends, let's first of all be aware of the amount of time it takes. Second thing, just to kind of think about, really, is I have been profoundly encouraged and reflected deeply on God's role in helping us make friends. So the author Malcolm Gladwell, who's a genius, love a lot of the stuff that he writes, but he talks about connectors. So he wrote a book called The Tipping Point, where he talks about why things catch on and others don't. And he says that in life there are these people who are really annoying. I don't know if you know anyone like this, John, who are just like they've kind of got the friend-making superpower. They're just unbelievable at making friends. But not only are they good at connecting with others, they're also really good at helping others connect with other people. So for example, I've got a mate called Andy, and Andy is an unbelievable connector. In fact, I know people at your church, hi Joe and Hannah, who I know through Andy. He's just got this amazing ability. So, and many of us, if we think about how we know some of the people in our lives, it'll be like, oh, I know about 10 people through your equivalent of an Andy. So I kind of began to reflect on this. So the first tip is get to know an Andy, right? Get to know a connector who can connect you. But the second thing is my kind of other kind of revelatory moment was that God is the greatest connector. And I really do believe that that I know an awful lot of people as well, because God has somehow made it really clear to me or them, or has just kind of pulled the strings of eternity and made those friendships happen. And I think what we often overlook is God's involvement in that. So I love that, the absolute epitome of this is Jesus at the cross, dying for the sins of the world. And he has the presence of mind in his physical agony and spiritual desolation to see his mother and say to his mum, John, say to his mum, this is your son. And he says to John, this is your mother. Like at the cross, he's connecting people. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we don't do enough of is kind of asking God, Lord, would you connect me to the right people? Before we go to a new church, Lord, would you help me? Would you give me the spiritual eyes to see who I'm meant to spend time with? And so my encouragement is, don't just pray for your friends. Pray for your friends that you need to make. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is really then being the kind of person that you would want in a friend. And so trying to think about kind of the friends that you want to have and trying to be that person. And I think a key there's some of that which is character. Some of that is kind of the virtues, the qualities that I think we're called as Christians to embody anyway. But also that's kind of there's some skills there as well. And so in the book, some of the things I talk about is what are really good questions to ask of people. Because I don't know about you, John, even on a Sunday morning, I'm quite good with people. But I sometimes like, what do I say to someone? What question do I ask? And so what I've tried to work on is a few really good questions that you can kind of build conversation, get to know people. Someone said to me, years ago, which has really stuck with me, popular people aren't interesting, they're interested. And I think some of that can really help you uncover who are the people who to deepen those relationships with.
It's great that you brought that, because I would say one of my real observations for many years now is that very few people ask questions. Like it is kind of an endangered species. Like right. I find it's great you cover it in the book. But yeah, I think of just how I'll regularly be in conversations with people, and I'll come away from the conversation thinking, wow, like they didn't ask me one question about my life. And then as a result, friendship can feel a bit one-sided and a bit lopsided. And so, just showing, I like that. What was that quote again about the interesting? It's interesting.
Yeah, popular people aren't interesting, they're interested.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a good principle. And I suppose it's linked as well with vulnerability. Like sometimes I think we can get frustrated. Oh, my friends aren't opening up very much. But again, I think we have to initiate that and set that culture. It might be a while before the other person feels that, but if we create that norm or that culture, especially with guys, like you said, it's funny. Like I think back to it's great guys who I've known since I was a little kid, played football many times together. But when we hang out together now, every Christmas, it's still the same chat. I have Man United with the right manager, who's going to win the Premier League. And you think, man, like a lot of good and bad and ugly stuff's happened in our lives in the past year, but none of that is discussed. It's like order another pint and then let's talk about another football related thing or a story from when we were 14. So it is hard to change that if you've always had just superficial level friendships. But I think looking out for those things and trying to create them, even if it takes time, is really valuable to do. And it's good that you're just giving practical tips. I think sometimes people say, I just don't know what to say.
Yeah, you highlighted something else there about kind of sometimes, you feel like you're doing all the asking of the questions, or you feel you're being more vulnerable than the other person. I also really, it was really impacted by some really nice language around that, which is about the kind of stretch of friendship. So you and I, John, both athletes,
Oh, yeah, top level professional.
Absolutely. But we know that in the kind of in the journey of fitness, there's a kind of stretch that your muscles have to go through. And sometimes in friendships, it can feel like there's kind of an unequal stretch between one person and the other. There's a kind of, I think it's a really helpful analogy to me, that you have to stretch together with friends. And if one person's stretching in terms of vulnerability or questions or availability or whatever, it can kind of, that's when sometimes, a bit like, we talked about, muscles can go ping, and sometimes where one person in the relationship's overstretching, doing all the vulnerability, making all the effort, and that sometimes can be where things begin to not quite, but where you stretch together, spend enough time together, that's where kind of beautiful friendships can be made.
Have you ever had a conversation with a friend where you've shared that you felt like the relationship was uneven?
I think, the friendship that comes to mind is, and this comes down to kind of change of circumstances, really. So my best mate during sixth form, there was a moment where we both went away, did our gap years, kind of had that last, kind of came back just before we started uni, intense kind of summer together, great fun, with a bunch of other mates as well. And then he went off to one university, I went off to another. And I guess there kind of came almost like a realization, moment where you kind of, I think you can, in kind of some kind of utopia, you think we're just going to be best mates forever. And that just then suddenly you just realize, I think my dad was really helpful. He basically said, mate, you're gonna have to go, you're gonna have to get over this, because it probably isn't. And I think therefore then there's a kind of, I couldn't necessarily pinpoint a conversation, but I can recognize in that moment, just watching that kind of friendship drift. And there were probably some conversations in that which kind of went, we know we're probably not going to see each other anywhere near as often as we would like to, and that being okay. And I think what unlike romantic relationships, you don't really get the kind of breakup. Most friendships either end with a big bang. So our friend Robin Dunbar says, or they kind of decay. There's a thing called friendship decay. And I think probably all of us listening will be able to remember or think of friends who've kind of we've just gradually lost contact, and constantly said, oh, we must hang out sometime. And it's not quite happened. And so I think probably more likely friendships have kind of ended that way. But I think certainly also, there is also a bit of emotional intelligence that goes on when you might be feeling like you're doing all the work, and then you kind of sense the other person isn't kind of giving that back to you. And maybe it's time at that point to kind of either have a conversation and say, look, whatever, or say, actually, I'm going to kind of invest my relational energy elsewhere. Read another fascinating book, where this guy basically said he asks people, he says, will you be my friend? And he said he had one person who said no.
Fair.
And I think sometimes that is the reality, and maybe that's a good thing to ask people, because if people don't feel they've got what they have to give, people might say no. That's okay.
And one of the reasons I ask is, I think when it comes to romantic relationships, there often are those intentional or formal moments where we say, the equivalent of that question, we say, will you go out with me? Or then you have the breakup chat, or formal moments where it progresses into another stage and that sort of thing. And I think that's where friendship can sometimes be a challenge, is it's not always clear to the sometimes people talk about in a dating relationship having defining what are we, and you have that moment where you're like,
it's complicated.
Exactly. There we go. I thought we were on a break to give Friends reference again. But I think with friendship, one of the challenges can be is there's not always those clear moments. I was chatting to a lady called Sarah Yardley recently on this podcast, and she was saying about how she has 3 close friends who she basically said, I officially want to recognize you as my inner circle. Would you be up for that? And I thought, I've never done it, but there was something beautiful about the fact of, let's make this intentional and kind of official, as it were. And she mentioned in the podcast actually how one person said, no, I don't. I don't want to be. But and in some sense, she said, well, that's very sad. But actually, I suppose in some senses, it's good that she kind of, it was clear, I feel this way, and they said, well, I don't, and you kind of get that out of the way. So I wouldn't say I've got to that stage of doing that in my own life yet, but I would say I have had a chat with someone where it was kind of are we gonna, I feel hurt in this relationship, are we gonna continue this or not? And the person said, I actually don't want to be close friends. And it was quite painful, but I'm so glad it happened, because I'd spent months just frustrated at them. Like, why? Like, I'm going through a rough time of life and you're never asking me any questions. And they basically were like, yeah, I just don't see you as one of my close friends. And it did hurt. But at the same time, it's like, okay, cool. Like, at least we're both on the same page now. And I think, I don't know how we do it, but I think if we were really going to value friendships, is trying to work out how do we have conversations that allow us to make them more intentional and more kind of formal? And going back to Jesus, I mean, he had the 3, it was very clearly defined, and the 12. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to see if Sarah mentioned some people are signing like friendship contracts and things like that, which I don't know if have you ever met anyone who's done a friendship contract before?
No, I've seen people write about it, but I've never been offered to sign on a dotted line. Maybe at the end of this podcast, John, we could exchange.
Yeah.
I'll put something in the post to you.
I can just picture it. I mean, it's the end of the January transfer window today in football. I can just imagine, like, friendship. You've got the kind of like the person there with the signature and the shirt behind them on the wall. And
I think we need a friendship transfer window. I think that's
yeah. I'm not really vibing this friend, but I think they'd fit with you actually. And what's your thoughts on on sharing friends? So yeah, that would be a transfer window. Yeah, that is funny. So you mentioned about the value of being a Christian and how that helps us be friends. And just stripping it right back, you think about the fact that we worship a triune God. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the most wonderful and unique things about Christianity is the fact that we follow a triune God who inbuilt in God, in the Trinity, is eternal and perfect and loving friendship, relationship. And I heard someone say a couple of weeks ago that we can't reflect a triune God on our own. And so it's almost like, as those who are trying to reflect God, to follow his ways and his kingdom, there's something sort of inbuilt in the ingredients of everything we do, which has to be in community. And even when we talk about church, I think there's a tendency, especially now, a lot of online options. People say, "Oh, I'm a Christian. I don't really go to church or kind of mix with other Christians a whole lot, but I have a faith." And I understand that, and sometimes people have been burnt by churches, etc., etc. But there's something about being a Christian which says, I can't do it on my own. I have to be in community. And would you say that's something that you kind of have seen in your studies of friendship from a Christian perspective?
Yeah, 100%. I think individualism attacks us from all sides, and I think the same is true for certainly our relationship with God and church. And I don't think you can do it. And so one of the reasons I've become so passionate about friendship actually is as a Christian, I think its implications are not just for evangelism. I think they're for discipleship, for leadership, for unity in the church, for intercultural church, for intergenerational church. And I think I understand, again, like you, why people have been hurt by church. I think one of the deep laments in me really is that I think there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of followers of Jesus in the UK at the moment who are just not going to church. And I think I think one of the things that God's doing actually is drawing those people back into church at the moment, which is really exciting. Was with a pastor last week who said someone returned after 20 years of being out of church and found home back in a church. And I think in our disconnected world, church is also one of those few institutions, I think there's hardly any left, where you get people of all different politics, wealth, ethnicity, story, language in the room together. Most churches I go to are the most diverse pieces of society I'm ever in. And I think it's beautiful. And of course it comes with challenges. And I think we need to, a bit like with friendship, we need to have an honest conversation that it can't be everything all the time to all people. And we're going to now and again say stupid things as we leave church, like I didn't get much out of the worship today. And Jesus says, I didn't realize it was for you. We're going to, that's always going to be the case. But I think I think it's critical to that. And again, I think when you talk to people about their formative moments in their journeys of faith, there might be somewhere they're on their own, but most of them, especially kind of having spent a lot of time with young adults over the last few years, most people would say it's not even the big Sunday thing it's been the kind of the moments in small groups, sat round, eating, doing the business of life, encouraging, being vulnerable, praying for one another. Those are the moments that help form us as disciples. And I think, we only have to look at the flaws of the disciples to see that it was so important to Jesus that he chose even such,
an eclectic bunch,
challenging, but glorious people. And to see the true value of being with one another and doing life with one another.
And I always find it interesting just how often the language, even in the New Testament, is corporate language. Like even when we think of, the Lord's Prayer being our Father, and the family language, as well as it being our Father, not my Father.
Yeah.
But we often talk about, my personal relationship with God, and all these things are good and true. But there's something that you completely miss out on if your faith isn't worked out in community, as you say. And I know in our church, a big thing is our small groups, or our communities, as we call them. And I think, a high percentage of people in our church, even though we really plug them all the time, would say I'd see this as peripheral to the Christian faith and not that important. And it's kind of a nice add-on if you've got time, or maybe if you're a bit lonely. But for the average person, not the average person, because we have tons of great small groups with great leaders and great people in them. We had ours last night and really enjoyed it. But how do you try and convince someone who basically sees corporate Christianity, that sounds a bit business like, community Christianity, friendship in Christianity as a kind of nice add-on, but it's kind of like good for those who need it, but it's not really essential?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question behind the question, which is actually kind of not necessarily what can I get out of it. I think so often what we do when we ask questions, even in terms of discipleship, is what am I getting out of this? I think it's also about what can we give. And so I think as I look at my own heart, sometimes I don't want to go to my small group. Sometimes don't want to go to church on Sunday, and sometimes I'm the preacher. and the challenge is not necessarily what can I get out of this. If you approach it from that, I'd go to small group 1 in 3 probably. The challenge is what can I give? Why is the group better when I'm there? And even if I'm in a bad mood, the group is still better when I'm there. And so I think we have to move away from this. I'm doing Bible verses with my 11-year-old. It's great. We're getting up and learning Bible verses, and we've been learning Mark 8:34 and 35, which says, whoever wants me to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. That's because I'm trying to teach my 11-year-old who will be bombarded over the next few decades of his life with a worldview which says, what can I get out of this? Have it your way. You've got the iPod, the iPad, iLife. Just have it your way. Tailor your life to yourself. Jesus says, come and die. Come and take up your cross and follow me. And the life of a disciple is not, convince me, persuade me to come and join a small group. It's how can I give myself? And I think the challenge even in this friendship conversation is that we can sometimes think, I'm going to become a friend because of the benefits to me. And sometimes I look at the book I've written and said, maybe it's a bit too individualistic in that way. But hear my heart in this, that actually I want people to be friends because at the heart of that is self-giving love. And I think if you said what one verse has shaped the friendship conversation for me over the last few years, it's John 15, where Jesus says, there is no greater love than they that lay their life down for their friends. So just before going to the cross, Jesus says, here's what friendship is. Friendship is the deep sacrifice of one to another. And that's why you should join a small group.
Yeah. That's great. It's a bit like you said, the comment of someone who comes away from church and said, I didn't get much out of worship. And, Jesus's response, I didn't realize this was for you. And similarly for friendship, and for life generally, it's about service. We have a Savior who came and washed feet and came not to be served, but to serve. And I think one of the things that often saddens, frustrates, makes me ponder is when people will say, I didn't go to small group, I didn't I didn't come along to church or whatever it was because I was feeling pretty low, I was feeling pretty down, and I just didn't want to be around people. And I understand that
people.
exactly, we've all been that, whether it's burdening or not wanting to show that side of ourselves. But I think, as you mentioned earlier, I think sometimes the most intimate moments in friendships and relationship building moments are where someone says, look, I don't really feel at my best. In fact, I probably feel at my worst. I might cry. I might say something dumb. I might, just not want to talk at all. So but I'm still going to show up, versus when people say, well, I don't want to be there because I'm not at my best. And I think, I don't know, you touched on this, but how do we help people see that, friendship isn't about bringing your best necessarily all the time. Sometimes it's just showing up and, bringing our sadnesses and sorries. I guess you don't want to go to the other extreme where when I see friendships where when they hang out, all they do is just moan the whole time. And I don't think they're necessarily life-giving moments, but does that kind of resonate with things you've heard people push back on when it comes to vulnerability and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it does. I think what I'd say is, I think it's about the long game. So I think if I think about my best friends, they've seen me at my very best and my very worst, and I hope still love me anyway. I think the challenge is when we're just getting to know someone, and maybe we're in that stage where we're trying to, we might feel that the jury's out with someone as to whether they're going to continue to be our friend, and we don't want to turn up because we're like, if I'm in a bad mood today, this might be the deal breaker as to whether they choose to be my friend or not.
Yeah.
I think that's why we need to be careful about thinking kind of about the different grades and levels of friendship, and certainly with those who we don't know so well, sharing and going too vulnerable too quickly can kind of make that muscle ping in that stretch thing. So we all know people, don't we, who've overshared on Facebook, and it's like, whoa! And I think the challenge is that we're not ready for that level of intimacy and that level of disclosure with people. Whereas if some people who there is nothing, if I think about those who are closest to me, there is nothing they could share that would shock me, that would make me less want to love them, less want to encourage them. I think it just relates to the levels and depths of intimacy. And so I think that that's always going to be a dance. So when we turn up to small group, if it's our fourth week of just being a mess, we might just think about putting a few filters on, perhaps, to think about how we do that. But I think even kind of showing up and is really important, because we can't follow Jesus alone. It was never meant to be a solo pursuit. And I guess the challenge comes when you're just getting to know people. But hopefully for most people, there's a kind of established relationships, and some of that will just take time.
We have a lot of families in our church, a lot of parents. And again, and we've touched on this briefly, but again, a big pushback is, ever since having kids, I haven't been able to have any close friends. Like that was the nail in the coffin to decent friendship. It's football on Monday, ballet on Tuesday. I'm knackered on Wednesday. I'm meant to go to small group on Thursday. I sometimes go Friday. We kind of sometimes have a date night if we can. And then it's like Saturday is all the other activities. And it might be that once a month we meet up with other families, but then the conversation is just terrible because all we're talking about is the kids, and they're interrupting and whining or... Obviously, you've got a family. How do people, adjust to that new season of life, but still maintain the value of friendship? Because I know you would say it's still important, whereas I think others again might say, I've got my spouse, I've got my kids, I'm all right relationally. But how as a parent did you adjust, and any advice you'd give?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is, when you're in those early years, you are in the trenches. I guess I speak as someone, I was having a conversation with my wife, fairly recently, going, we're only just getting sleep for the first time in like a decade. So the first.
How old are your kids, by the way?
Yeah, they're 11 and 5.
Nice.
And so we are in the glorious stage where we've got no teenagers and no toddlers.
Nice.
So I think the challenge, I totally hear that, and again, hear me well on this. Maybe we're going to recognize, a bit like you said about retired people, that are seasons in our life where we've got even more finite relational capacity, and so it's okay to spend a bit less time with friends when you're just in that. I think the other thing I'd say is, sometimes and I'm speaking to myself as much as anybody else here, sometimes we can think that we can be the best parent by giving our kids football on Monday and ballet on Tuesday and drama on Thursday, whatever. Sometimes I think we can be the best parents to our children by being kind to ourselves and having a really good marriage and really good friendships. And I would ask the question sometimes of myself and others, that if our lives are dominated by our children's social events at the expense of our marriage and our friendships, then maybe the balance just needs to be tipped back a little. And it's okay to think about kind of reining in some of that stuff so that we can invest in our friendships. Because actually, without our friends around us, without a really good marriage, we can't be the best mum or dad that we can be to those around us. And so, and again, I haven't got this right necessarily, but I think one of the things that we've tried to do kind of as a married couple and as friends is really try to invest in those and try, because I think otherwise when you're taking your kid to football and ballet, you're a grumpy dad, you've got no one to talk to, and that nobody wins. And actually in the end, the children don't win, because also one of the big dreams I have for my boys is that they have really good friendships, and I want them to see me modeling that really well, and I want them to be really good husbands. And so again, I want to see them, so I think we need to not, I think one of the great kind of challenges of our world, I see a lot of kidolatry, where the whole world is kind of, around the kids. And again, hear me well on this. I'm not judging anybody. I think we all need to make our decisions well here and be wise. But I think God hasn't made us just to throw all of our eggs into the baskets of giving our kids the perfect middle class lives, which I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of doing.
Great answer. That's great. You mentioned right at the beginning of the podcast about friendships between those who are Christians and those who aren't. And as you say, I think for a lot of people, for example, if we're encouraging people, why don't you invite someone to come and try church? They often say, I don't really have many Christian friends. And I think some of that is, naturally spend a lot of our time at church and church events. And as you said earlier, often there's a depth that comes from having a shared mission, a shared belief system. And so naturally, that's going to mean that some of your friendships develop deeper in church than they would outside. But as you say, we're also called to go and share the gospel. And we don't just befriend people who aren't Christians because they're a target, they're an aim. We're just going out to convert them. We befriend people and love people because they're made in the image of God, as you said. But what would you say to people who are like, I just don't know how to build any relationships with people who aren't in my church? I just, it's only ever surface level. Like, are there any ways in which people can develop those deeper relationships outside of church friends?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent it's down to back to the basic values we talked about before. Non-Christians are still people. So I think it's down to, first of all, praying, Lord, who are you calling me to spend time with, involving God in that conversation as to where we spend our relational energy. And then the values of time, presence, and vulnerability still apply. The values of asking really good questions, being interested, finding common ground, all of those kind of friendship principles that we talked about, and the book goes further to develop that depth of friendship. But also, I'm not even necessarily sure we need that deeper friendship necessarily to do the invitation to church. I think so. I think of like we had a neighbour who's sadly moved away last summer. We were gutted because he was amazing, but I didn't know him that well when I invited him to church, and he's kind of come along. And at the same time, I've had neighbours who haven't come to church, and we've invited them along and they don't come. And but so we need to tell stories of failure as well as success. And even as those was with evangelism on our job title, I still completely get it wrong a lot of the time. But then I think there is something about the kind of the depth of friendship which does allow you to have kind of deeper conversations. But I think it's about just making sure we don't fall into those kind of Christian bubbles. And for people like you and me, Jon, who are paid by the church or Christian organizations, that can be particularly difficult. But for me, I have to find other ways of being really intentional. So we've got friends who we watch like the Formula One with, who kind of don't yet know Jesus. We've got other friends who we kind of we choose to kind of go on holiday with. and just try and find those kind of moments that will lend themselves to depth. And if we haven't got any, think about our interests, think about joining a club, think about kind of going and being in spaces where not yet Christians are, and seeing who God draws into your path. And many of us will have friends in the workplace. And I think what I'd say that I'm observing with my not yet Christian mates is there is an openness at the moment, which I haven't seen in a while. I think the Collins Dictionary word of the year for 2022 was permacrisis, extended period of instability or insecurity. And I think there's this kind of sense that the world is unstable at the moment. And I think that is causing people to ask deeper questions. And sometimes we can be that kind of non-anxious presence. We can be those people of hope in those spaces. And so, so I think making sure we have a good balance there of Christian, non-Christian friends, and finding those opportunities to deepen those friendships can be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Great advice. And I think with all that's going on, there are fresh opportunities. And even going back to questions, I think of how I've heard people who aren't yet Christians say, you're the only person at work. This obviously isn't where I work. I work for a church, but in other contexts where people say, no one else has ever asked me about, what I do in my life, or asked me about how I'm doing. And I think because so few people genuinely actually care, to be someone who cares, who's consistent, who asks questions, there's an amazing opportunity to really show God's love and to build deep relationships in the vacuum that's often there, in the loneliness that so many people experience. So just before we close, Phil, I'd love for you you shared some amazingly helpful, like big picture stuff, some theology stuff, some real practical stuff too. But just as someone who's about to finish this podcast, listening in, and they're like, right, I want to put this into practice even today. What's kind of a practical step that they can maybe do today or this week to start growing in friendship?
So I'd encourage you to in the book, I talk about circles of friends. So, I mean, you could even buy the book and do this, or I can just tell you about it now, right? So what I'd encourage you to do is draw kind of concentric circles, like a bit like a kind of dartboard. If you don't know what Google concentric. My mum was a maths teacher, so she'd be very proud of me at this moment. But then, so I would encourage you to kind of take kind of 15 minutes and pray and say, God, who are the people at the varying levels of intimacy in my world at the moment, and put your really close friends in your middle circle. If you're married, your spouse will hopefully be in and around there. If you've got a best friend, they'll be in and around there. But then as you go out, there'll be other people who you know a little bit, but not so well. And they might be just a friend. You might have a good friend who's kind of in the kind of middle circle. And so within these 3 or 4 circles, I'd encourage you to put the friends there and just spend some time with God, praying about kind of who are the people who you need to increase that intensity of friendship with? Who are the people who you really want to get to know and really develop bonds of trust with? And maybe then take their name and kind of draw an arrow towards the kind of center of the circle. And then pray about how it might be that you develop that relationship, maybe inviting them for a meal, or going out for coffee, or going for a drink after work, or whatever that is. And then have a look at the kind of the circles of friendships that you have, and think about where are the not yet Christians in those. And you might even draw up a list if you've got kind of 3 or 4 names in your circle. So you're like, they're people I know who I'd really like to come to know Jesus. Maybe think about beginning a list of them to pray for those people to come to know Jesus. And then the final thing I'd suggest is thinking about the people who are different from you. Because I think one thing we haven't talked about, but I think is quite important, is being friends with people who are slightly different from us, different age, different backgrounds. And so maybe just kind of having a little circle around them and thinking, how am I going to get to know them, and how might that enrich their lives and mine? And as I said, just remember the kind of the finite amount of energy you have. But my encouragement to you right now is to kind of pray and kind of really think about what are the friendships that you're going to prioritize. I think my final message to people is don't let friendships happen by accident. Choose to really be purposeful and intentional about where you invest your friendship energy. Friendship's a gift from God that he gives us, but also we get to give others. And so thinking really well about that, and hopefully those circles will help you to do that.
Amazing. Phil, thank you for sharing your practical advice as well as your heart and your stories and your successes and failures. And such an important part of being a follower of Jesus and just a human being generally. So I'm sure that would have helped and blessed many people. And just to say it again, I think this is the third plug I've given it. So I definitely need some commission now. The Best of Friends by Phil Knox. It's just a great read and helpful for anyone who wants friends and needs friends, which is pretty much everyone there is. So do grab a copy of that. And if you want to see what Phil is getting up to, what's the best way to connect in with your world, Phil?
Oh, I don't know.
Don't know. You're not an influencer. You're not a TikTok. You look like an influencer.
You can find me. You can find it. That my profile picture on all these things looks better than what you're looking at now. So. But you can find, I've got a page on Facebook and a Twitter and an Instagram. I've got a fairly, unusual name, so not KNOX. You can find me.
Yeah, John Brown definitely is. It's like finding a needle in a haystack if you search John Brown online. So not the best. But yeah, Phil, thanks so much for coming on. And pray that God blesses you and all of your ministry and your family and friends. Thanks, Phil.
Bless you, mate. It's been a joy.
Cool. Thanks a lot.